Chapter 22. The Queen of the Basutos. No, no, go not to Leth, neither twist wolf's bane tight-rooted for its poisonous wine, nor suffer thy pale forehead to be kissed by nightshade ruby grape of Proserpine. Make not your rosary of yew berries, nor let the beetle, nor the death moth be your mournful Psyche, nor the downy owl, a partner in your sorrow's mysteries. For shade to shade will come too drowsily, and drown the wakeful anguish of the soul. Keats. As the train rolled on toward Bloemfontein, I told myself that all was not well, as Will Braithwaite had intimated. The officials were attempting to undermine my business, but this worried me less than an indiscretion of my own. I had found among many enemies one who seemed to be a new friend. William Price, a young Englishman, had gained the implicit confidence of Benjamin before that good sailor's death, while Freighter and Elliot's cargoes had been falling off. Price had been securing contracts for the Pedro Gorino from other sources. At last he had been handling so much of the shore business at Cape Town that he had become virtually the ship's agent. On my recent visit to Cape Town, I had met Price for the first time and had taken a liking to him from the start. His eyes had seemed a trifle narrow, though gray and frank, and his countenance had appeared to me to be open and friendly. Yet, as the wheels of the train clicked monotonously on the rails, and as I left Cape Town farther and farther behind, I told myself I'd been duped. Why had Price insisted that I transfer my money to the bank in which he held stock? Easier to arrange for credit, he had said. It had seemed plausible at the time, but it seemed insufficient reason now. And why had I become so garrulous with Price and with the bank's officials? Their courtesy was not founded on friendship. It was merely my deposit of several £1,000s, sufficient reason for civility anywhere in the world. Of course, I had realized that in the near future I was going to need a loan of a considerable amount of money, but I should not have run the risk of putting my entire plan before these people. It had all come about quite naturally. The Larathidi, king of Basutoland and the most powerful ruling native in South Africa, had heard of my desire to help the Ethiopian race. He and his favorite wife, Queen Baring, were anxious to secure my help and had invited me to visit them in their fertile and mountainous country. They had practically promised me a sizable concession of land in return for my services, and I had been anxious to accept their proposition. To some extent, I had anticipated their offer from my earlier correspondence with the king, and while still in Pondoland, had made a rough map of the route a road might follow from Port St. John's to Basutoland. I had discovered all the drifts in the rivers and all the traversable passes through the mountains. I had planned to transport the great stores of extra produce grown in Larothody's well-watered country over this route to Port St. John's. From there, they could be taken to Cape Town on the Pedro Gorino. With a large concession in Basutoland and such a system for marketing my produce, I dreamed of gathering enough gold to help my race very materially, and there was always the possibility of a coalition of the Basutos and the Pondos, which would be one more step toward an Ethiopian empire. But it had been indiscreet to show them my entire hand, even to secure their promise of a loan. They had promised to back me to the extent of £20,000 if I secured such a concession and opened such a road as I had outlined, yet I felt strangely insecure and at their mercy. During my stay in Cape Town, I had arranged all my affairs, reconditioned my boat, and prepared for another absence. I had made Will Braithwaite captain of the Pedro Gorino, and had advanced the boatswain, an intelligent young West Indian, to the position of first mate. I had left much of my business in the hands of Price, and although, even at the time, it had flashed across my mind that he had seemed a little too anxious to help, I had been reassured when I remembered his faithful work with Benjamin. I had stayed long enough to see the boat load, and make its departure for Delagoa Bay. Then, satisfied that all was well, I had caught a train for Bloemfontein in the Orange River colony, as near as I could come by rail to Larothody's Kraal. Now I was filled with apprehension. Little remarks that Price had made began to come back to me. They had meant nothing then, but they seemed significant. Now, I argued with myself that it was useless to worry. I thought of my many assets, my good-sized bank account, the Pedro Gorino piling up profit on every journey, my possibilities of a concession in Basutoland, and the promise of backing to develop such a concession. Very soon now I would be in a position to do more for my race than any colored man before me. What could my enemies do except take my material wealth? They could not undermine the influence I was already gaining with the natives. They could not undo my work once I had instilled the desire for liberty in those fertile Ethiopian minds. I would attempt to lead my race toward a new goal. I might even hope to help counteract such disastrous influences on the natives as those Cecil Rhodes and his cohorts had brought to bear. By the time I reached my destination, my mind was at rest. I had informed Larothody and Queen Baring of my plan to visit their country, so when I disembarked at Bloemfontein, a delegation of natives was awaiting my arrival. After I had had a good night's rest, we all mounted our horses and proceeded towards Maseru, the King's Kraal, some 80 miles distant. In the region of the Caledon River, we found the most picturesque country in South Africa. Everywhere there were mountains and cliffs and plume-like waterfalls on 100 streams. I have seen Switzerland, but I prefer the country of the Basutos, for while the views are scarcely as magnificent or vast, it offers a greater variety of scenery and is less spoiled and more wildly romantic. Single huts of stone, and in places whole kraals cling miraculously to the cliffs. The veritable cliff dwellers who inhabit these abodes are as agile and daring as Kilpspringers. Even the children we saw ran and jumped along the narrow pass as if a misstep did not mean a fall of 500 feet to certain death. But the country is not all mountainous. Its great fields of mealies on the river bottoms and in the lower hills would almost entitle it to be called the granary of South Africa. Everywhere in the rougher country might be seen herds of cattle, sheep, goats, and particularly horses, for the only horses the British will purchase are those bred in Basutoland. I saw that this country was capable of a rich export in skins, hides, ostrich feathers, mohair, and grain. And when I realized that I had mapped a shortcut to the sea, a road which, with the expenditure of very little money, would handle wagon train loads of produce, I knew that soon I would be independently wealthy. When I arrived at Maseru, I found it an almost impenetrable mountain stronghold, built high on a cliff overlooking miles of rugged country. Here I was introduced to King Lorothadi and Queen Baring, a very handsome couple. The king was a stately-looking middle-aged man, dressed in European fashion. The queen was taller and more slender than the average native woman. She had a sensitive, intelligent face, and was an educated lady and a Christian. She wore Parisian dresses of pale yellow and green silks, and seemed a fitting mate for Lorothadi. And then whom should I meet but Judge Con Ridout, an old friend of mine back in Mississippi. He wore a high silk hat and a Prince Albert coat, even up there in the mountains, and he ran legal phraseology all through his conversations. In introducing me to his Basuto friends, he would say, "Inasmuch as you all have not heretofore met my esteemed friend and brother Captain Harry Dean, nor the aforesaid Dean become acquainted with you all, I should like to make the presentments of each to the other, and the other to each. But we all have our idiosyncrasies, and Judge Con Ridout was an excellent man and a clever lawyer. He had helped King Lorothadi out of many difficulties with the English, had organized a parliamentary form of government in Basutoland, and occupied an important post in that government. He accompanied me to the low, massive stone house of the king whenever there was to be a conference over my plans in Basutoland. The king and queen were always receptive, and before the first week had passed, I had outlined my entire scheme. I offered to build the road to Port St. John's at my own expense, and helped to organize an adequate system of schools in return for any piece of land they wished to concede. I explained that I was not interested in personal gain, and that everything I realized from a concession would be utilized in helping my race. The king was courteous, but the queen was actually enthusiastic. She and I had numerous talks upon these matters, and I showed her how easily we might effect a coalition between the Pondos and the Pondomeses and the Basutos. She was clever enough to see that her husband would be king over such a union. With these and other things in mind, she granted me all her property on the Caldon River. The concession, when developed, would have been easily worth £1,000,000 sterling. While it gave me a fortune, it also gave the Basutos several big advantages. Although they were the most powerful native nation in South Africa during the Boer War, they were no match for the Boers. To put the holdings of an American citizen between them and their old enemies more than counteracted their disadvantage. For as Lorathati explained, although the Basutos could put many thousand men in the field, their lack of guns handicapped them tremendously, and their enemy's advantage was only to be neutralized by some such ruse as the one just employed. There is no such thing as private property in Basutoland. I held my land, however, under the same right that the Queen had held it. By the native law it was mine. It was mine to cultivate and exploit, mine on which to pasture cattle or build cities. There was, of course, the enormous task of developing my holdings, but I felt certain that it was within my power. My end of the bargain was not easy. I was to collect all the educators and builders I could persuade to come to Basutoland, and start them on the work of developing the country. We dreamed of a center from which culture could radiate to every corner of Africa. It was in the pursuance of this, the hunt for the right sort of men, that I started out over the trails of South Africa, while the Boer War was still raging, riding with 1 or 2 companions on horseback. Daily I met with danger and adventure, and so it was I turned up in every village and kraal, karoo and veld, searching for men. Chapter 23. A Battle with the Bears. From this point forward, my adventures in Africa assumed a bright, illogical sequence with little rhyme or reason. I was traveling everywhere, combing the country for intelligent colonists to go to Basutoland. I received Segao Faku's permission to extend the road through his country. I wired Cape Town for materials to be shipped to Port St. John's via the Pedro Gorino. One by one, the cogs in my great machine began to function. The first man whom I was able to persuade to join my colony was a worthy young American from Georgia by the name of Douglas. The world in general is, perhaps, unaware of the manner in which the natives in South Africa are treated. At Bloemfontein and elsewhere, they are segregated from the European element by confinement in compounds, where they are forced to wear collars and tags as if they were dogs in a kennel. Because he was a colored man, Douglas had been forced to live in the compound at Bloemfontein, and to submit to the humiliation of one of these dog collars. Despite all his protests and his frequent assertions that he was an American citizen, the authorities condemned him to live this prisoner of war type of life. I met him shortly after I had begun my travels in search of colonists, and I was so incensed at the story of tyranny which he related that I determined to secure his release. Although he had lost his papers, I knew by the cut of his jib and the degree of his education that he was an American and that his story was true. I appealed to the American Council and to 5 or 6 important officials at Bloemfontein, and managed to secure his release. The matter was quickly hushed up for the American government, while not thoroughly honorable in all respects, will seldom endure such insults to its citizens as those heaped upon Douglas. As this young man was an expert stone mason, I was anxious to get him for my project in Basutoland. He was very grateful for having been freed, and readily accepted my proposition. Incidentally, I saw something of the Boer War in my travels. De Wet's raid on Cape Colony had been repulsed, and the Boers had been driven back. They were now playing hide-and-seek with Ian Hamilton and General French. These Boers were the toughest, most God-forsaken bunch of mortals the world has ever seen. They were, for the most part, Low Dutch mixed with Hottentot, with just enough American pirates, slavers, and hijackers added to imbue them with sin and love of the devil. The English robbed and mistreated the natives on every possible occasion, but the Boers, because they had no gentility and no antecedents whatsoever, outdid their neighbors in all forms of iniquity. There was, however, a certain romance about these men. These great coarse fellows, with wide felt hats and bandanas about their necks, were to be seen here and there in mounted detachments, fighting valiantly enough, deluded though they were. I was all through South Africa during the Boer War, but I did not see any real battles until I had left Bloemfontein and gone to Thabanchu, a town at the base of the impenetrable mountain down which, in earlier years, the Basutos had rolled boulders upon their enemies, thus resisting attack after attack by English Boers and natives. Here at Thabanchu I had met again my old friend Lieutenant Garvin, an Australian-born Englishman, son of a big iron manufacturer. He was a graduate of Oxford, and at this time an intelligence officer on the staff of Ian Hamilton. He was quite alone and scouting for news of the Boers. He asked me if I would like to accompany him, and since he would be able to get me through the lines to any point in South Africa, not actually in the hands of the Boers, I accepted gladly. I was particularly anxious to go to Kimberley to see some men about my project, and since the army was moving in that general direction, I saw that it would be to my advantage to accompany it. We both had horses. When he had completed his work at Thabanchu, therefore, we put our belongings in our packs, mounted, and galloped away to join Ian Hamilton. After several hours of riding, we came upon the English, who were encamped upon the veld 50,000 strong. They were out to capture De Wet, who was harassing them with his guerrilla warfare. We spent the night among them, and the next morning were up with the dawn. With admirable economy of effort and quite orderliness, this great army prepared to move forward. They formed 8 columns at intervals of 1/2 mile each, so that the front ranks, which advanced simultaneously, stretched almost from horizon to horizon. Like an enormous comb it moved forward across the veld, and woe betide the unfortunate Boers caught in its teeth. Lieutenant Garvin and I were like 2 restless spirits. He was on special duty, accountable to no one but Hamilton himself, and never obliged to stay with the columns. We traveled far out onto each flank, and beyond into the open country and hills on either side, scouting for bears. On the third day out from Thabanchu, on the veld some distance northwest of Bloemfontein, while the columns moved forward in their typical formation, a shot was heard from a kopje directly before the right wing. I have never seen such perfect organization as that evinced by the British. The effect of the shot was immediate and certain. Within 2 minutes, the 8 columns were closing together as a fan closes, and within an incredibly short time they were in solid formation, half encircling the hill. The manner in which those men responded to the report of the bear gun seemed to me to symbolize the whole internal organization of their country. No matter how much disharmony might occur among themselves, let a shot ring out, or an enemy appear, and they join forces and present a solid front, just as they did on the plain that day. Sometimes it has been to such ignoble ends as reducing the natives, and again it has been to do battle in a righteous cause. The air was tense. No one knew whether there was one bear or an army of many thousand men. Over the edge of the hill, Lieutenant Garvin and I rode our horses out to the right flank to get a better view of the country up ahead. Stationed upon a little rise, we watched the maneuvers. The whole army was in khaki, even to the officers, for while red coats had been more romantic, the English had at last learned how impractical it was to make their men blazing targets for the enemy's guns. These khaki-clad figures almost blended in to the veld, and I could imagine that at a distance they would be quite invisible to the naked eye. The infantry was well ahead of the artillery, and before the guns could be rushed up, the officers had ceased to ride back and forth, giving orders to the Tommies, and a great hush had fallen, a silence so intense as to be terribly depressing. Then the 3-inch guns, 6 to a battery, rolled up and took their positions. In another minute, the bombardment had begun. The roaring of the guns and the bursting of shells was deafening. As we looked up toward the hills, a mile away, where the bears were presumably hiding, we could see the crest nearest us literally blown to pieces. It seemed as if no living thing could exist in such a rain of steel. After 15 minutes of this, Ian Hamilton gave a signal, and the firing ceased, and the infantry were ordered to attack. All along 2 miles they advanced, a solid line with fixed bayonets, the left and right wings, by encircling the hills, tried to outflank the enemy. With that purpose in mind, our units advanced double-quick time. Until this time there had been but the one shot from the bears, and I thought it perfectly possible that the whole army was on a wild goose chase. I was just contemplating how ridiculous they would feel on reaching the deserted hills, when Garvin, more experienced in this sort of warfare than I, explained the bear technique. He thought it probable that the shot had been fired to bring the English into a solid formation, where more damage could be done with a few well-placed shots. The original report had come, he believed, from a point some distance from the actual position of the bears. This would mislead a great deal of the English fire. "But why are they silent now?" I asked. "Their guns aren't particularly effective at this distance," he said. "You'll hear from them soon enough." The words were scarcely out of his mouth when the Bear artillery opened fire on the English lines, which were now within a quarter-mile of the crest of the hills. In their 2 minutes of shelling, nearly 200 Tommies fell. The line never wavered, but plunged on up the steep incline. Then, as miraculously as it had begun, the firing ceased. On our wing there was an English officer, who was as immaculate as if he had been on parade at Aldershot. He wore a monocle, and his uniform fairly shone. In one hand he carried a cane, for he limped slightly from some old wound or injury. His orders were given in a high feminine voice: "Column right into line, march." He had a perfect Oxford accent, but the pitch was an octave too high. We could scarcely conceal our amusement upon seeing this ladylike sample of London drawing rooms fighting such a tough, hardy bunch as the Bears. He passed within 20 feet of us, and just as he came abreast, one of the last shells the Bears fired fell halfway between his column and the little knoll where we were sitting upon our horses. It threw up a great cloud of dust, but bounded another 75 feet before exploding. No one was hurt, but the officer's uniform was dirtied. He pulled a white handkerchief from his pocket, flicked away the dust, and said so audibly that we could hear him, "Fancy that! This beastly dust." We could not refrain from laughing outright, but we did not miss the fact that he was a brave man, and had not shown the least concern at his narrow escape. A few moments later we galloped off, and circling the right wing, reached the top of the Kopsch, only a few moments after the first of the infantry. As Lieutenant Garvin had predicted, most of the English fire had been misdirected by the simple ruse of the Bears. Some 200 dead, in all their rough romantic garb, were lying on the ground, and a dead bear, because of his size and dress, looks like 3 dead Tommies. But not a live enemy was in sight. In a protected spot a short distance away, we found the hoof-prints of some 1,000 horses that had been tethered there. 6 or 7 old-fashioned field guns had been abandoned, but with the exception of these signs of recent activity, there was no way of telling that hundreds of bears had been there 10 minutes before. They had slipped away on their fast horses, down a dry ravine, to the northeast, and although a detachment of cavalry was sent to overtake them, the bears soon lost themselves in the wild country with which they were so familiar, and left the English far behind. The next morning, when the army was again prepared to move forward, Garvin was given the order to precede the columns by several miles. Watching the hills for any sign of the enemy, he and I set forth at daybreak, and traveled along a road which wound down a fertile little valley, with hills on either side. A clear stream bubbled along beside us, and on either hand might be seen the orchards of the bear farmers. The weather was clear and exhilarating, yet warm enough for comfort. It was almost impossible to believe that a war was in progress, for nothing could have been more peaceful than this pastoral scene. Several times during the morning we dismounted and examined the ground closely, but there was no thing to indicate that a large body of men had recently passed this way. Occasionally we left the road and went to the crest of nearby hills to view the surrounding country. It was always with the same result: nothing of interest within the range of our binoculars. At one point we came upon a little bear of 7 or 8 fishing in the stream. We asked him if men had recently passed this way, but he was so frightened that he never uttered a word, but dove headlong into a patch of willow growth, and hid there like a terrified little animal. By middle afternoon we had grown a bit careless, and were riding down the road laughing and talking, but as our conversation came around to the war again, Garvin suddenly became more serious. "You know," he said, "it would be strange if right now, within a few months of the end, some bear took a pot shot at me. I've taken as many chances as a man can, and I've come out without a scratch, but somehow this afternoon I have a premonition of trouble." I tried to cheer him up in every way I knew, but for almost an hour he was very quiet, and seemed to be deep in thought. It troubled me, for Gavin was usually the most light-hearted of men. It was within an hour of sunset when we reached a bend of the highway hidden by mimosa and willow growth. Beyond this bend the road wound up a low range of kopjes. These hills, together with the overhanging trees, made a perfect setting for an ambush. Suddenly, from the hills and trees which were on our right, a volley of 50 shots rang out. The bullets poured into us like rain. Once again, Garvin had been right in his prediction, and that brave fellow fell to the ground with a bullet through his heart. His horse, which had been mortally wounded, plunged and fell to the ground, tearing up the gravel of the highway in his agony. I was untouched, but my horse had been badly wounded in the flank. This, and the sound of the shots, and the other animal pawing the gravel, so terrified him that he swerved and raced back down the road, almost throwing me from the saddle. There was no way of controlling my wounded mount, so I merely let him have a free rein and hung on. I thought mournfully of the once light-hearted Garvin lying dead in the road, and I hoped against hope that the English could capture or kill every one of those bears. A few minutes later I reached the column and was able to get my beast under control. I informed the first officer at hand of the bear ambush up ahead. A unit of cavalry was immediately dispatched, but although these men rode like the wind toward the scene of the disaster, they found no trace of the bears. They recovered the body of Garvin, however, which was given every honor and subsequently shipped to his grief-stricken father in Australia. Chapter 24: Diamond Kings and Diamond Smugglers. A few days later I reached Kimberley. Almost the first man I met upon my arrival was Kid Gardiner, and he seemed as debonair as ever. He had finally been released from prison and some weeks before had come to the Diamond Country to join Haji Hassan. He appeared to be more prosperous than an English lord, and I determined once and for all to uncover his mysterious source of income. I asked him point blank, "Kid, what's your game?" He pulled out a big uncut diamond, flipped it into the air with his thumb, and returned it to his vest pocket. "That's my game," he said. So that was it. He was diamond smuggling, was he? I was keenly interested and quite unable to conceal my curiosity. At first he was weary, but as the days passed he disclosed to me the greatest diamond smuggling outfit in South Africa. He offered me a chance to make a tremendous fortune if I could overcome my scruples. He and Haji Hassan had the smoothest little system I've ever seen. Haji was the mastermind of the organization and controlled all the business from Mafeking, where in his daily life he played the role of an illiterate Malay. To allay suspicion, he ran a small grocery store, where his trade amounted to some 30 shillings a day. The kid was Haji's Kimberley agent, and therefore his right-hand man. But Haji had 500 others in his employ, scattered through all the diamond diggings in South Africa, and a system of runners who traveled at night over the unfrequented paths of veld, karoo, and jungle, natives who knew every inch of the country and could be trusted with a pouch of stones worth 50,000 pounds. And Haji Hassan sat on the porch of his grocery store in Mafeking, dozing through the warm afternoons, talking to his occasional customers or spelling out the words of the evening paper. And he, the greatest Arabian scholar in Africa, little did the English dream that here was the man for whose capture they were spending thousands of pounds a year. Nor did it avail the officials to take his agents and his runners. They were in honor bound never to betray Haji, and if the kid knew the real facts in the case, Haji was never in danger of capture but once. That had been much earlier in his career, when he had been controlling his organization from Port Elizabeth. In those days, he had taken more chances. His wife, a beautiful Malay girl, used to slip aboard the boats that came to the harbor and offer the European passengers stones at a price far below that which they would have to pay elsewhere. For almost 2 years she was successful in escaping detection, but a jealous woman betrayed her, and one day Haji's wife was arrested and thrown into prison. Her bail was set at 100,000 pounds, which Haji was able to furnish only by sacrificing most of his fortune. Once he had her safe outside the prison walls, he lost no time in putting her aboard a ship bound for Arabia. The bail was, of course, forfeited, and Haji spent the rest of his days separated from his wife, but he at least knew that he had done the only honorable thing. As the kid told me of Haji and of the fortunes awaiting successful smugglers, I was tempted to join forces with these men. Why not? What right had the English to exploit a country that by every natural law belonged to the Ethiopian race? Why should we not try to regain our own? They all were smugglers and thieves when you came right down to it. Even Gardiner Williams, superintendent of the De Beers mines, indulged in in piracy now and then. He played his own particular role in the raid on the Transvaal, and if that attack by John Hayes Hammond, Dr. Jameson, and their army of mercenaries was not as thorough a case of brigandage as the pampered sons of imperialism ever attempted. I do not know villainy when I see it, but the bears beat them at their own game, and made the hirelings scatter like leaves before the four winds, and because his brother was among them, Cecil Rhodes had to pay Paul Kruger £1,000,000 if he had paid him a shilling to keep that wily bear from executing half a dozen of the most picturesque and bloodthirsty freebooters Africa has ever seen. No one gets but few of the actual facts of such matters. They had to save Jameson's reputation, and Gardiner Williams' reputation, and Cecil Rhodes' reputation, and the reputation of the British government. And after that, there was little of the truth they dared let slip. There is no use of my risking my life by telling what I know, when I also remember how the English had robbed the natives of Griqualand west of their diamond mines, and passed laws which made it legal for their powerful courts to condemn these same natives to life imprisonment if an uncut diamond was ever found in their possession. Even my affiliations with the African Methodist Episcopal Church scarcely served to keep me from joining Haji Hassan and Kid Gardiner. My sentiments were those of the Africanado, sentenced to 17 years on the breakwater for finding a diamond beside his own doorstep, when he said, "'Dis a fruit dat grow in my country, why you say no pick?" The kid could see that I was interested, and since I had befriended him in the past, he let me in on many of the secrets. There were several ways of smuggling diamonds out of the mines of South Africa. Each race had its own method, but Haji Hassan had the safest and surest system. The mines were worked by natives under contract to serve for a stipulated period of time. Every few months it was necessary to recruit new labor from the kraals. Shortly before the recruitment, in any particular kraal, Haji would plant several of his confidential men, strip them of all outward signs of civilization, array them as the natives themselves, and leave the rest of the deception to their own intelligence. These men could appear every bit as unsophisticated as the natives, and although the De Beers agents were continually on the watch, they were deceived over and over again. After they had been employed and taken to the mines, they awaited their chance. The mines are heavily guarded and surrounded by high fences of barbed wire. It is absolutely impossible for an outsider to get in and out of the properties. To further complicate matters, the employees are made to live within the guarded fences. None of these difficulties worried Haji. Once his men were inside, he secured just such daring, brilliant fellows as the kid to complete his system. The Texan was absolutely trusted by Gardiner Williams, who thought him a fine type of American Negro, and allowed him to accompany sightseers and now and then guide parties through the mines. The rest was comparatively simple. By legerdemain, the men inside slipped the kid the diamonds they had secreted about their persons. He would sometimes leave the mines with half a dozen big stones. One afternoon he showed me a pouch containing 50. Because of the danger of holding the uncut stones, runners were dispatched every few days to Haji Hassan at Mafeking, when his hidden treasure boxes held the accumulation of several weeks of plunder from among the various mines in South Africa. He would prepare a shipment for transportation to a firm in Amsterdam, Holland, with which he did all his business. He had a particularly faithful runner with whom he entrusted this packet, who covered the distance between Mafeking and Delagoa Bay in remarkably short time, considering the rough, unfrequented paths over which he ran. One trick which saved Haji's men more than once was an old ruse indeed, but a successful one. Every runner and agent in his employ was given orders to swallow his stones if close pressed. Even Kid Gardiner was forced to resort to this on a number of occasions. My acquaintanceship in Kimberley was not limited to diamond smugglers, however. I had heard that Gardiner Williams was a Californian, and so one day I decided to approach him. He was a very gentlemanly fellow, and had I not known his past, I might have been inclined to disbelieve the stories concerning his hard, crafty nature. He had known my uncle Solomon in California, and he treated me very civilly indeed. I became well acquainted with him during my stay in Kimberley, and one afternoon he invited me to come to his office to see a collection of stones he had gathered. We entered the unpretentious brick buildings that housed the offices of the De Beers diamond mines. He went to the enormous safe which filled one wall of the room, gave the dial a whirl, threw back the 40-ton doors, and removed from its shelf a collection of diamonds, which for some years was considered the finest in the world. The tray was 5 feet square, lined with green velvet, and on its surface, as thickly scattered as dewdrops on a field of clover, were 15 or 1600 purest water diamonds. The afternoon sun which fell through the window shone and glittered on the great tray of treasure, and there within my reach was wealth enough to found the Ethiopian Empire, of which I had dreamed so long. 3 feet away was a hoard which would have civilized and educated half the natives of Africa, all gathered into one heap for a single man's pleasure. There were diamonds on that tray of every shape and size, but all of the same purity. There were pear-shaped diamonds, and diamonds cut in diverse ways. Some were only 2 or 3 carats, and some must have been 50. I wanted to plunge my hands into the treasure and go forth into free Africa. I wanted to alter the course of destiny and administer justice in my own way. It would have been useless. I would have been shot down before I could have gone 100 yards. Then the fever for diamonds filled me, and I was as mad for treasure as the thousands who had gone before me. The wild excitement that had lured men across seas and continents, into freezing wildernesses, and through steaming jungles, engulfed me. I had money, so I bought a diamond machine, an invention which washes the diamonds from the dirt in the alluvial deposits. I hired natives. I went before the officials and was allocated a claim near the Vaal River. I arranged for the purchase of water, and early one morning transported all my equipment to the desolate, boulder-strewn country where men labor year after year in search of little stones, and cry for joy when one is found. Soon we were washing tons of conglomerate filled with batumes. a small round stone which invariably appears in the region of diamonds. The dirt was full of garnets and semi-precious stones. Every few minutes one of the men would find one. We must have picked up a pint of these in the first week, but not one diamond rewarded our search. I was not to be discouraged, however. I urged the natives to even greater efforts by promising them more pay, with an extra reward to the man who could find a stone. On the 10th day we found our first diamond, a fine 16-carat stone, which cut would have brought many $100 in the right market. But the licensed buyers, locally known as Kupshawallapers, to whom we were forced to sell, gave us but £16. The find cheered us greatly, however, and seemed to have changed our luck, for from that day forth we took diamonds from the dirt with satisfying regularity. I had been in this country several weeks, and had made a considerable amount of money, when fortune began to turn against me. Kid Gardiner came to me one day, entirely out of funds. For a long time his smuggling had been completely successful, but recently he was being watched. One sentence on the breakwater had made him weary, and on this occasion he knew enough to stop before it was too late. A week before, when he had delivered his last pouch of diamonds, he had had a small fortune. Since that time he had gambled heavily and lost every shilling of it. I gave him money, and he was often to be seen about my diggings. Whether the English grew to hate me because the kid was in my company, or whether it was their usual grievance against my presence in South Africa, the fact that they felt I was a dangerous character and an organizer of the Ethiopian movement, I do not know, but certainly they began to harass me in every possible way. One of the devices often used to trap the unsuspecting small operator is to send a native to him with an unregistered rough diamond, with the hope that he will purchase the stone and thus throw himself open to immediate arrest. I was told a day in advance that the English intended to play this trick on me. When I told the kid what I had learned, he explained how I might out-trick them. "Listen, Captain, when de boy comes with dat stone, grab it and pretend as how you've thrown it clear across de river. Den snap it up yo sleeve and cuss him out of yo diggin's fast as he can travel. Den, as far as de bulls know, you ain't got no stone, and when night comes, yo put it wid de rest and get 'em all registered." The next morning several Englishmen came to my diggings, and wandered about asking questions and examining the soil. I knew well enough what they were up to, but I pretended not to notice them. About 10 o'clock, a native with a suspiciously good command of English came and offered to sell me a beautiful big uncut diamond. The Englishmen gathered around us as though mildly interested. I snatched the stone from his fingers and pretended to throw it as far out among the boulders. In reality I snapped it up my sleeve, where it remained until I had an opportunity to remove it. At first the Englishmen were amazed, then they were furious. They had lost a big diamond, and had been cheated out of the pleasure of arresting me. They were unable to conceal their displeasure, and I knew that my trouble had only started. I was right in this surmise, for 2 days later I found a diamond planted in my cot. I removed it hurriedly, fully realizing what to expect. Less than a half-hour later our camp was literally torn to pieces by officers searching for unregistered stones. My cot was kicked over, and the bedding ripped to shreds. One of the Englishmen who had been at my diggings on the day the first trick had been attempted was so angry that his face was contorted with rage. "I'll get you if it takes me the rest of my life," he said. I knew that the time had come for my departure. The imperialist not satisfied with unlawfully seizing a country, exterminating great numbers of the male population, virtually enslaving those who remained, and reducing the whole race to abject poverty, had become so jealous of their stolen wealth that they were unwilling to let an Ethiopian acquire even that part of the treasure which their own unjust laws allowed. I sold my outfit at a loss, paid off my help, and prepared to leave the country as quickly as possible, taking with me 16 unregistered stones, of which the 2 best were the ones the English had so grudgingly given me. The kid made a run for Johannesburg, where he was later murdered, so he is where this evidence will never be held against him, gone back to the dust of his motherland, where I hope some day to lie.